It began not with sirens, but with silence. Not with missiles arcing through the sky, but with whispers in the cane fields and radio signals drowned in static. In the heart of the Caribbean, a lone Cuban militiaman clutched his rifle as flames devoured the jeep his comrades had arrived in. The night air crackled with gunfire not from a foreign enemy, but from countrymen. Cuban had turned against Cuban. What could drive a man to kill his brother for the sake of a flag not his own? That night, at the Bay of Pigs, blood soaked the sand, not from a decisive battle, but from a catastrophe that would bind Cuba's fate to a superpower half a world away. A failed invasion, a global standoff, and a revolution caught in the crosshairs of Armageddon. But this story is not about Washington or Moscow. It is about Havana, about the men who lit cigars with shaking fingers in the Palacio Presidential, about mothers clutching children as shadows moved overhead, about a people caught between empires. The world knows it as the Cuban Missile Crisis, a chess match of Cold War titans. But to the people of Cuba, it was not a game. It was a betrayal, and it left scars deeper than any crater a missile could have made. To understand Cuba's descent into the storm of 1962, one must return to the roots of its revolution. The year was 1959. After years of brutal dictatorship under Fulgencio Batista, a man propped up by American dollars and defended by American weapons, the island erupted. Led by a bearded lawyer named Fidel Castro, the ragtag rebels of the Sierra Maestra marched into Havana to the cheers of peasants, students, and workers. It was not simply a victory of arms. It was a catharsis. Cuba had been, for too long, the plantation of the North, its sugar, tobacco, and rum controlled by foreign corporations. Its elections, little more than theater. Its sovereignty, a facade. The revolution promised more than a change in leadership. It promised dignity. Castro moved swiftly. American businesses were nationalized. Agrarian reform was implemented. Literacy campaigns swept through villages like wildfire. But dignity came at a price. And that price was war, though not in the traditional sense. The United States, unwilling to lose its hold on what it saw as a backyard colony, launched a campaign of pressure, sanctions, isolation, covert operations. And then, in April 1961, the pressure became bloodshed. On the southern coast of Cuba, at a place called Playa Girón, exiled Cubans trained, armed, and transported by the Central Intelligence Agency came ashore in an attempt to unseat Castro by force. The Bay of Pigs. But the plan shoddily constructed, tactically unsound, and arrogantly assumed to ignite a popular uprising collapsed within 3 days. The invaders were either killed or captured. Cuba celebrated. But something had changed. For Castro, the invasion proved what he had long suspected. The Americans would never accept a sovereign Cuba under socialism. And so, he turned to the only power that could guarantee his survival, the Soviet Union. It was not love at first sight. When Castro declared in December of 1961, "I am a Marxist, Leninist, and shall remain one until the end of my life," many in Moscow raised eyebrows rather than glasses. Nikita Khrushchev, the mercurial Soviet premier, was pragmatic, not sentimental. Cuba, to him, was a pawn, a tropical outpost to counterbalance American missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy. Still, a pawn in the right place could check a king. By early 1962, the dance had begun. High-level Soviet envoys arrived in Havana. Conversations were cloaked in euphemisms, but the message was clear. Would Cuba host Soviet nuclear missiles under full Soviet control in exchange for protection? Castro hesitated. He understood the stakes. These would not be Cuban missiles. His army would not even be permitted to access them. If discovered, the United States might launch a preemptive strike. But to refuse would be to show weakness. To accept, at least, bought time and weapons and a seat at the global table, however small. Reluctantly, he agreed. By July, Soviet engineers, troops, and equipment were flooding into the island under intense secrecy. The project was codenamed Operation Anadir, a deliberate misdirection, named after a cold region in Siberia. In the sweltering heat of the Caribbean, missile silos began to rise. But Cuba was no Siberia. Rumors spread. Farmers whispered about strange trucks in the night. Students spotted uniformed Russians in bars. And in Washington, alarm bells began to ring. On the 14th of October, a U-2 reconnaissance plane snapped grainy photos of nuclear missile installations under construction in San Cristobal. The next day, President John F. Kennedy was briefed. 8 days later, he addressed the world. In an 18-minute broadcast, he declared a quarantine on all military shipments to Cuba. Though not a blockade in name which could have constituted an act of war under international law, it was a clear message. Remove the missiles, or face the consequences. But while the world gasped and held its breath, within Cuba, a different reality unfolded. Official news outlets remained silent. Radio Havana insisted nothing was amiss, yet Cubans knew better. In towns and cities, people left their farms and traveled to be near family. Catholic and Santeria prayers mingled in the streets. Food became scarce. Eyes turned skyward at every passing jet. There were no fallout shelters. No mass evacuations. Only dread and defiance. Castro took to the podium and thundered, "What have we done? We have defended ourselves. That is all." He demanded that Khrushchev declare any attack on Cuba would be considered an attack on the Soviet Union itself. But Moscow did not comply. To Khrushchev, Castro had served his purpose. The bluff had been called. Now it was time to negotiate before someone did something reckless. But reckless was exactly what Castro became. Castro was not privy to the back-channel negotiations taking place between Khrushchev and Kennedy. He saw only the buildup, the jets slicing through Cuban skies, the distant but certain hum of war. So, on the 26th of October, he wrote a letter, a fiery, desperate plea to the Soviet premier. In it, he warned that an American attack was imminent, likely within 72 hours. And if it came, Khrushchev must respond not with diplomacy, but with the full might of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. This was not mere rhetoric. Castro ordered his forces to fire upon any American aircraft violating Cuban airspace. The next day, on the 27th of October, the order was fulfilled. A U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-supplied SA-2 surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed, the only casualty of the missile crisis. The world shifted. Inside the White House, Kennedy's advisors clamored for retaliation. Generals demanded airstrikes, and some even prepared for a ground invasion. In Moscow, Khrushchev felt the ground slipping beneath him. His son, Sergei Khrushchev, later recalled, "It was at that moment, not before, not after, that my father knew the situation had left his control." The U-2's downing, the product of Castro's eagerness to escalate, inadvertently forced Khrushchev and Kennedy to step back from the edge. Both men, for all their ideological resolve, did not want nuclear war. But they had a problem: Fidel Castro. He had become the uncontrollable variable, the loose cannon on the deck of the ship of state, as one Soviet diplomat later said. In a war of nerves, he was the clenched fist ready to strike, regardless of the cost. And so, in secret correspondence over the next 48 hours, Kennedy and Khrushchev drafted a way out. The missiles would be removed from Cuba. In exchange, the United States would publicly promise not to invade the island. Quietly, and not for public knowledge, Kennedy also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. It was a clean, elegant solution. Except for one thing. Castro wasn't told. When the phone rang in Havana on the 28th of October, it was already over. Khrushchev himself delivered the news. The missiles would be gone. The threat neutralized. The United States had agreed not to invade. There would be no confrontation, no Armageddon, no final stand on socialist soil. Castro was devastated. According to those in the room, the Cuban leader flew into a white-hot fury. He trashed his office. He kicked in furniture. He smashed glass. He roared obscenities into the phone at Khrushchev, including at least one insult so potent it remains unprintable in Soviet archives. How could Khrushchev do this? Cuba had risked everything, its sovereignty, its safety, its soul for the cause. And now, with no consultation, the Soviets had pulled out. To Fidel Castro, this wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. The missiles had been Russian. The control had been Russian. And now the decision was made by Russians. And so, in secret correspondence over the next 48 hours, Kennedy and Khrushchev drafted a way out. The missiles would be removed from Cuba. In exchange, the United States would publicly promise not to invade the island. Quietly and not for public knowledge, Kennedy also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. It was a clean, elegant solution. Except for one thing, Castro wasn't told. When the phone rang in Havana on the 28th of October, it was already over. Khrushchev himself delivered the news. The missiles would be gone, the threat neutralized. The United States had agreed not to invade. There would be no confrontation, no Armageddon, no final stand on socialist soil. Castro was devastated. According to those in the room, the Cuban leader flew into a white-hot fury. He trashed his office. He kicked in furniture. He smashed glass. He roared obscenities into the phone at Khrushchev, including at least one insult so potent it remains unprintable in Soviet archives. How could Khrushchev do this? Cuba had risked everything. Its sovereignty, its safety, its soul for the cause. And now, with no consultation, the Soviets had pulled out. To Fidel Castro, this wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. The missiles had been Russian. The control had been Russian. And now the decision was made by Russians. Despite his rage, Castro could not stop the withdrawal. But he would make one thing clear. No American inspectors would set foot on Cuban soil. Though the United States had demanded the right to verify the removal of missiles, Castro flatly refused. If American personnel landed on the island, he declared, they would be shot and their bodies dumped into the sea. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Soviet ships carrying the missiles would be inspected in international waters, far from Cuban territory. A small consolation for Castro's bruised pride. But the damage was done. Across Cuba, the population simmered with a mixture of relief and betrayal. Some, weary from weeks of fear, returned to daily life in silence. Others, particularly within the Communist Party, were furious at the Soviet climb-down. Chants filled the streets. Khrushchev, you coward. What is given as a gift is not taken away again. State media, caught off guard, scrambled to reframe the narrative, first condemning the Soviets, then abruptly halting all mention of the missile affair entirely. Even Che Guevara, ever the revolutionary, was disgusted. In private, he told confidants he would have personally fired the missiles had he been given the chance. To him, it was never about politics. It was about principle and the chance to obliterate capitalism from the map. In the years that followed, Cuba remained socialist, firmly entrenched in the Soviet orbit. Economic and military support resumed, and relations with Moscow were patched at least on the surface. But beneath it all, the memory remained. Fidel Castro never fully forgave the Soviets. For the rest of his life, he would wield Cuba's revolutionary credentials as a moral bludgeon, reminding both East and West that his island had once been ready to burn for its beliefs. Ordinary Cubans, too, carried the scar. In interviews decades later, Cuban exiles recalled the fear that gripped them in Miami, unsure if the United States would suspect them of treason, unsure if war would reach them too. Inside Cuba, families huddled together not for defense, but for dignity. If we were to die, one woman recalled, we would die together. The missile crisis passed, But Cuba remained changed. Not a proxy, not a pawn, but a nation caught between giants, betrayed by both, elevated by neither. For many in the West, the Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of diplomacy. Two rational superpowers, standing on the brink of oblivion, pulling back just in time. A lesson in restraint. A case study in brinkmanship. But in Cuba, the story was far darker. From the Cuban perspective, this was not a noble standoff. It was a cynical arrangement, a deal made between titans, with no seat at the table for the nation that had risked everything. Fidel Castro's anger was not just personal, it was national. Cuba had been used and discarded. The image was burned into the Cuban psyche, a revolutionary island wrapped in red flags, its people ready to die, only to be left standing alone. In the years after the crisis, Havana became more militant, not less. Castro ramped up internal security. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, expanded, surveilling neighborhoods. The intelligence apparatus grew deeper, sharper. Opposition voices were silenced more efficiently, often without a trace. If the missile crisis had proven anything, it was that external threats were real and that Cuba would have to rely on itself. At the same time, the psychological distance between Havana and Moscow widened. Despite the continued presence of Soviet aid, Castro now saw the USSR as a partner of convenience, not ideological kin. Cuban communism became more nationalistic, more rigid, and far more emotionally charged. The events of October 1962 cemented something else. Cuba's foreign policy would be uncompromising, shaped by a core belief: only Cubans could be trusted to defend Cuba. By the time the Cold War finally thawed in the early 1990s, the world had largely forgotten that Cuba had once stood at the epicenter of annihilation. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. And Cuba? It was still there, still sanctioned, still defiant, still socialist. But the decades had taken their toll. Without Soviet support, Cuba entered its special period, a time of deep economic hardship, rationing, and isolation. But the pride remained intact. Fidel Castro, until his death in November 2016, never recanted. He remained a symbol to many in Latin America, a man who had outlasted 10 U.S. presidents, who had stared down an empire and survived. Among the Cuban diaspora, especially the exiles of Miami, the story was different. To them, the missile crisis had been a horror averted, but also a missed opportunity. Had the invasion succeeded, had the United States stood firm, perhaps the communist regime would have fallen. Instead, Castro was entrenched. The revolution, once fragile, had been hardened in nuclear fire, not destroyed. Their bitterness lingered. The promise of return, of reclaiming homes and land, remained a dream passed down through generations. In the decades since, historians have pored over declassified files, diplomatic cables, and personal letters. The missile crisis has been retold, revised, and re-examined. But one truth continues to haunt the narrative. Cuba was silenced at the most critical moment of its own history. Why was Castro not consulted? Why were the people who stood to lose everything, the land, the sky, the soil, not given a voice? Was it a strategic oversight? Or was it the inevitable outcome of a world where small nations serve only as leverage in larger games? Even today, echoes of this betrayal ripple through the Caribbean and Latin America. Nations remember. They remember how sovereignty can be erased with a phone call between Washington and Moscow. Fidel Castro once said, "History will absolve me, but history does not absolve. It remembers." Cuba remembers not just the missiles, but the silence. Not just the risk, but the disregard. What began as a gamble to protect the revolution nearly ended in annihilation. And yet, the revolution survived, scarred, suspicious, and forever changed. For Cubans, the missile crisis is not a story of balance or victory. It is a story of what happens when your homeland becomes the battleground for giants. It is a parable about dignity, betrayal, and resilience. And in that perhaps lies its true legacy. In the early mornings of post-crisis Havana, when the embers of potential war had cooled and the radios returned to their usual hum, life slowly resumed. But it was not the same life. Shops reopened. The ration lines grew longer. Children returned to classrooms where lessons began with revolutionary slogans. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms, a subtle tension lingered, the kind that never fully leaves after a close brush with oblivion. Castro, though hailed by his inner circle as the leader who had stood firm against imperialism, withdrew into a more cautious paranoia. His speeches became longer, his policies stricter. For the Cuban people, the revolution began to feel less like a sunrise and more like an overcast noon. Still, in the bars of Havana, older men would speak in hushed tones. They would sip strong coffee or rum and light cigars with slow, deliberate care. And sometimes, with the smoke curling around their heads, they would say what official papers could not. We were used. Not defeated, not destroyed, but used. And that is perhaps the most tragic truth of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not that Cuba nearly vanished in nuclear fire, but that it never truly mattered in the decisions that spared it. The legacy of the crisis echoes in places less visible than missile silos or memorials. In the education system, where generations were taught that resistance, not diplomacy, was the ultimate virtue. In the military, where preparation for invasion from the United States or anyone else became not a contingency, but a constant state of mind. In the psyche of the people, who had to reconcile two identities: revolutionary survivors and expendable pieces on someone else's board. And perhaps most hauntingly, in the foreign policy of future generations of Cuban leadership. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even when economic desperation pushed the island to open cautiously to tourism and investment, the core distrust remained. The crisis had taught Cuba that even allies would act without consultation, that no promise was truly safe. It is not an accident that Cuba clung to its autonomy more fiercely than many of its peers, that it defied sanctions for decades, that it kept building its own mythos, the nation that stood on the edge of the abyss and spat. Far beyond geopolitics and ideology, there were the human stories, the people seen as background characters, by history whose emotions, fears, and convictions animated the moment. Like Marta Darby, a Cuban exile in Miami, who remembered the whispers of internment camps, the quiet dread that even in America, her origins might make her a target. Or Maria Salgado, a young girl in Havana who watched as distant cousins came to stay, all of them convinced they would die, and wanting only to die near family. They were not generals, not diplomats, just people. And in their memories, the missile crisis was not a triumph of diplomacy. It was trauma wrapped in silence. How do you teach a child to live under the shadow of nuclear war? How do you explain why her homeland was nearly reduced to glass by men who had never set foot on its beaches? History often remembers missiles and movements. Rarely does it remember mothers who did not sleep. What was gained? For the Soviets, a political win quickly spun into legend: we stood up to America. For the United States, the removal of missiles, the preservation of credibility, and a lesson in calculated diplomacy. But for Cuba, a brief moment of geopolitical relevance, followed by disappointment, disregard, and the slow erosion of the hope that once lit the fires of the revolution. Would things have been different if Cuba had had true agency at the table? If Castro's fear, rage, and revolutionary zeal had been channeled rather than dismissed? Or was the betrayal inevitable, the price of proximity to empires? Those questions still hover in the humid air of Havana. Closing reflection. A fortress of memory. Today, Cuba remains a land of paradoxes. It is poor, but proud. It is isolated, yet legendary. Its people have endured hardship, repression, and exile, but also carried forward a narrative of survival few nations can claim. And at the heart of that story sits October 1962, a month where the world almost ended, and where Cuba for a moment held its breath not as a puppet, not as a proxy, but as a people determined to survive. Perhaps that is why, even now, as history books focus on Kennedy, Khrushchev, and missiles, the true legacy of the crisis lies elsewhere. It lies in the faces of those Cubans who remember, who still feel the vibrations of bombers overhead, who still taste the salt air and wonder how close the end truly was, who still carry in silence the knowledge that their country was once a fuse lit, held and nearly burned without their consent. That memory is why the crisis never truly ended, and why its echoes still drift, like cigar smoke, through the soul of an island that refuses to forget.